Citizens of Togo who are against the government are getting a lot of backup from groups all over Africa. Right now, the government is looking at a new set of rules for the country, which the opposition has been asking for. 8 big groups from different African countries have put out a statement saying they support the Togolese people who are fighting for change. These people also want the current president, Faure, to step down. He's been the leader since 2005. Some of these supporting groups are pretty famous, like Balai Citoyen from Burkina Faso, Y'en Mar from Senegal, Aina from Chad, and Lucha from Congo. They think what's happening in Togo, people standing up to the government, is part of a bigger wave of change happening all across Africa. So, leaders from these groups are asking the whole world, especially the West African countries, ECOWAS, to help the people of Togo get the democracy they want. They hope this will stop bad situations like those seen in other African countries from happening again. For over 10 years, most of the groups against the government in Togo have been demanding these new rules, mainly to make sure a president can only be in charge for 2 terms and to change how voting happens. It was still very early and dark when the first army trucks drove down the empty main streets of Lomé, the capital city. The streetlights were blinking on and off. People were still asleep, but big changes were already starting. At 4:12 in the morning, soldiers wearing black uniforms and masks surrounded the president's palace. They moved quickly, with no warning. By the time the palace guards figured out what was going on, the soldiers were already inside. This wasn't a practice run, this was the real thing. Inside, President Faure, who had ruled Togo for almost 20 years, was alone in his office. He was confused, not wearing any shoes, and holding his phone, but it wasn't working. Just a few minutes before, a scared voice on his special secure phone had whispered, "They've got us. The army isn't on our side anymore. They're coming for you." He didn't believe it at first, until he heard gunshots and saw his own best bodyguards turn their guns away from the gates and point them at him. Then he was arrested. The explosion that broke down the palace doors was so loud, people 3 streets away heard it. When news reporters arrived, it was already over inside. Soldiers, men Faure himself had chosen, dragged him through the fancy hallways. His tie was loose, his face was white, and his powerful image was gone. One soldier leaned in and said quietly, "Your time is done. Togo has chosen freedom." The whole world was watching. Someone leaked a live video that had never been seen before. It showed Faure, without shoes, his hands tied behind his back, being walked down the palace steps. There were no news cameras or fancy cars, just the sound of soldiers' boots, flags flapping, and the growing cheers of people outside celebrating their freedom. By 6 in the morning, everyone in Togo had seen the video. By 7, it was a top story all over the world. Faure was out, and Togo was rising up. The streets filled with people. Thousands came out in Lomé. Some were crying, some were shouting, and some just fell to their knees, hardly believing it. Is it true? Is he really gone? Did we finally win? They asked. Women played drums, and young men held up signs they had kept hidden for years, saying things like, "No more kings ruling us. Africa isn't a kingdom. Togo belongs to us now." In the middle of it all was a little boy, maybe 10 years old, holding a homemade flag with one word written on it in charcoal, "Free." Togo had woken up, but the rest of the world was just starting to understand how important this moment was. It wasn't just one man losing power, it was the end of a whole long period of rule. To understand why the palace was stormed, you have to look back, way back, over 50 years. Togo's problems didn't happen overnight. One family, the Nasingbays, had been in control since 1967, almost like they owned the country. First, there was Nasingbay Ayadima, a soldier who took power in a military takeover and stayed in charge for 38 years. He ruled very strictly. Elections were just for show, not real choices. People who disagreed with him would disappear. The news was controlled. Fear was how he ruled. When he died in 2005, his son, Faure Nasingbay, took over the presidency like it was a family business passed down. Faure got into power very quickly, and many people thought it was suspicious and planned. Just hours after his father died, the army announced that things would continue as they were. They didn't ask the people, they just told them, "You had Ayadima, and now you have his son." People in Togo watched quietly because anyone who spoke out against the family faced tear gas, being forced to leave the country, or worse. Faure started out sounding good. He spoke French well, had studied in Western countries, and had a friendly smile. He talked about making things better and modernizing Togo. But the more he smiled, the tighter the control became. He broke his promises about fair elections, blocked changes to the country's main rules, and ignored limits on how long a president could stay in power. Behind the scenes, advisors from other countries supported him, as long as business deals kept coming and France kept its influence. To the public, Fur looked like a reasonable leader in West Africa. But privately, he was building up a system based on fear. The young people saw through it. But Fur didn't understand one thing: the generation born after 1990 was different from their parents. These young people watched speeches by inspiring leaders like Thomas Sankara on their phones, read about African unity on Instagram, shared news about military takeovers in Mali and Burkina Faso on WhatsApp, and dreamed of leaders who earned their positions, not inherited them. They weren't scared, they were wide awake. And when leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta in Mali took stands, young people in Togo thought, if they could do it, why can't we? A secret agreement started quietly within the army. It began with whispers among soldiers, quick looks between commanders, secret messages, and shared unhappiness. Young Togolese army officers, who had trained in other countries and seen democracy work, came back home feeling disgusted by the system they were supposed to protect. They didn't necessarily hate Fur, they just didn't want to support a lie anymore. Togo had been quiet for a long time, but it was starting to wake up. Soon, the man in power would face the one thing he was most afraid of: his own people standing up for themselves. For many years, Colonel Kwame Agbiom stood by Fur Nassing Bey. He seemed loyal and strong, not just Fur's bodyguard but like his shadow. He knew the president's secrets, which government officials were stealing money, and which opposition leaders were being silenced. He walked the palace hallways at night and heard things no one else did. For years, he kept quiet. But then, something changed for him: a line was crossed. Late one night, Colonel Agbiom got an envelope with no sender's address. Inside were photos of a burned village, crying women, a bleeding child, and a young man, the colonel's own cousin, lying dead in the dirt. He had been killed by Togolese soldiers. The army said it was an operation against rebels, but it was really a punishment for a region that had dared to protest against Fur's rule. That's when the colonel realized he wasn't protecting a president anymore, he was protecting a cruel system that hurt its own people. So, over the next 6 months, Colonel Agbiom started building a secret group. They weren't rebels or hired soldiers, they were patriotic Togolese men in uniform, captains, lieutenants, intelligence officers. They were all young, angry, and very quiet about their plans. They communicated in code, shared maps, schedules, and plans of the palace. They called their plan Operation Minuet, which means midnight. The countdown to the takeover began. 7 days before, officers quietly changed guard schedules. 4 days before, security cameras in important parts of the palace mysteriously stopped working. 2 days before, a final message was sent to allies in Burkina Faso and Mali: get ready. The old lion is about to fall. And on the day itself, while Lomé was asleep, Colonel Agbiom unlocked the inner palace doors and let justice walk in. He didn't see himself as a traitor, he saw himself as a liberator, even though he was wearing the uniform of the old system. And that night, the roar came. Just after the sun went down, in cities and villages all over Togo, something amazing happened: people stood up. There were no main leaders or political parties organizing it, it was just ordinary people, angry, tired, and brave. In Lomé, thousands marched down the main roads holding signs they had made themselves, saying, "No more kings. Power to the people. Togo is not for sale." Soldiers were supposed to stop them, but some soldiers dropped their guns, and others even joined the marchers. By 9 p.m., the city felt alive, not with destructive fires, but with the fire of a new beginning. People lit bonfires in front of government buildings and sang revolutionary songs that hadn't been heard since 1963. They waved flags, not for a president, but for a people taking back their voice. In Sokode, young men surrounded a police station and demanded that arrested protesters be freed. When the police chief refused, they formed a human wall and chanted, "You'll have to shoot all of us. We are Togo." In Kara, Fur Nassing Bey's hometown, where people had always been too scared to speak out, something unbelievable happened: a statue of his father, Nassing Bey Ayadima, was pulled down by former soldiers. As the statue crashed to the ground, the crowd was silent for a moment. Then someone whispered, "It's over." And everyone burst into tears of joy and relief. Nobody told them what to do, they just knew. It wasn't just a protest anymore, it was like the whole country was waking up. Women banged pots and pans, people on motorcycles drove around honking their horns in celebration, and even street sellers gave away food for free. It was a mix of happiness and anger, pain turning into power. For the first time in many, many years, the streets of Togo weren't filled with fear, they were filled with people. And as the night sky glowed with fires and the feeling of freedom, one message was heard across the country: the ruling family has fallen. Now we rise. When the sun came up over Togo, the rest of the world finally started paying attention. News headlines everywhere rushed to report what was happening. Army takes power in Togo. End of the Nasingbe family rule. Revolution in West Africa. But while people in Lomé were dancing in the streets, the most powerful countries in the world were very quiet. The African Union, a group of African countries, had an emergency meeting. Some countries wanted to punish Togo immediately, but something was different this time. The representatives from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood up and walked out. They weren't interested in putting a leader back in power who just did what others wanted. They saw a new Africa being born, and they didn't want to stop it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré from Burkina Faso even gave a rare speech on TV. What the people of Togo are doing isn't illegal, it's the right thing to do. They aren't destroying order, they're ending oppression. We don't support military takeovers, we support freedom. The room went quiet because this wasn't just a message to the African Union, it was a challenge to the whole world. For Nasingbe, who used to be the most powerful man in Togo, was now sitting in a cold military courtroom with no windows. There were no red carpets, no fancy cars, no carefully written speeches for him, just silence and the eyes of his country watching him. The courtroom was full of people, army officers, people who had suffered under his rule, journalists, and mothers whose sons had disappeared. Outside, thousands more stood in the sun, listening to the trial on loudspeakers, waiting to hear what the man who had ruled them for 19 years would say now that he had no power. The charges against him were read out loud: stealing money, cheating in elections, government-sponsored violence, misusing public money, and being involved in torture. When the last charge was read, a woman in the front row whispered, "That's what happened to my brother." For didn't even blink. He was wearing a simple white shirt, no tie, no medals, and just sat there silently. Then, the first witness spoke. He was a former government minister, someone who used to shake hands with important people from other countries, sign business deals, and smile for cameras. Now, his hands were shaking as he testified. He talked about bribes paid to foreign companies, and millions of dollars stolen from money meant for hospitals, schools, and roads. He admitted he had delivered envelopes full of cash to fake charity organizations, and that money ended up in bank accounts in Paris. Then he looked at Faure and said, "I did it for you, but I did it because I was scared, not because I was loyal." The room was completely silent. Next, a mother whose university student son was killed during protests came forward. She held up her son's notebook, stained with blood. "This is why he died," she said, "not because he hated anyone or wanted revenge, but so that one day you would be sitting right where you are now, being judged for what you did." For the first time, Faure looked down, and his hands tightened into fists. The court gave him a chance to speak. He stood up slowly, cleared his throat, and said, "You think you understand power. You don't. Power isn't what you hold, it's what holds you." He didn't cry or apologize, just made an empty excuse, like a man who thought being president was his birthright. The military judge ended the session for the day, but outside, the crowd already knew what the outcome would be. History had already made its decision. And for the first time in anyone's memory, the people believed that justice could happen, not from the old system, but because of the courage they had finally found. This wasn't just a trial, it was a moment of truth for the whole country. And it wasn't over. The French government in Paris was not happy that Faure Nasingbe had lost power. For many years, Togo had been like a quiet customer for France, dependable, obedient, and good for business. While Faure was in charge, French companies got good deals for mining, the military worked closely with France, and France had a lot of influence in West Africa. So, when news of Faure's arrest reached the French president's office, they were alarmed, not because of democracy, but because their interests were at risk. Behind closed doors, French intelligence officials had an emergency meeting. They quickly decided, we have to get Faure out. If he talks, if he confesses what he knows, we could lose our influence in the whole region. So, they approved a secret mission. Within 48 hours, a French Special Forces team was sent out under the code name Operation Eclipse. They were well-trained, armed, and flown in. Their mission: sneak into Togo pretending to be on a humanitarian mission, get to the place where Faure was being held, and take him to safety in the nearby country of Benin. But they didn't realize how much the new Togo had changed. Colonel Kwame Agbiome, who was now leading the temporary military council, got a tip from someone inside the French embassy. Satellite images had picked up an unauthorized plane, and secret communications confirmed where it was going. The message was clear: they're coming. Agbiome acted fast. He put Protocol Zero into action, a secret defense plan made with help from Burkina Faso's intelligence. They set up roadblocks, turned on air defense systems, and stationed a top Togolese commando unit at the detention center. France denied everything, but the proof was too strong and made them look very bad. All across Africa, people were furious. In Mali, a statement was broadcast on TV: "This is why we left ECOWAS, the West African group. This is why we don't want to depend on others. Because even when we try to make a fresh start, they come to steal our chance for justice." In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré talked about it on national TV. "They tried to steal Togo's dignity in the dark. They failed. And next time, they won't get away." This wasn't just about war anymore, it was about whether African countries could truly be independent. Togo had shown the world not just a dictator, but a whole unfair system. And the message to France was no longer a whisper, it was loud, clear, and coming from the whole continent: "You can't manage us. You can't rescue us. We don't belong to you at all." Colonel Kwame Agbiom stood before the National Assembly, the country's main lawmaking group. He wasn't in full army uniform, but in a simple dark suit. He wore no medals, no signs of his rank, and he wasn't promising to rule forever. He looked tired, but the crowd saw something else in him, a man who had risked everything to end a family's long rule and was refusing to just replace it with his own. His speech was short. "I will not take power," he said. "Togo doesn't belong to any one man, not to me, not to the Nassing Bey family, not to the military. It belongs to the people." A hush fell over the crowd. Some people cried, others clapped slowly, not sure if they could believe him. In Africa, soldiers often take power and then become the new strong rulers, so Agbiom was doing something different. Instead of making himself president, he announced a transitional council for national rebirth. This council would be made up of different kinds of people: civilians, military officers, and people representing young people and women's groups. Their job was very clear: organize free and fair elections within 6 months. Rewrite the country's main laws to ban families from ruling and to stop presidents from staying in power for life. Investigate the crimes of the old government with an independent group. And, for the first time ever in Togo, show every council meeting live to the public. Power would no longer be hidden away in the palace. This announcement brought something rare, a feeling of careful hope. In the capital city, artists painted over old murals of fallen protesters with new pictures: young people planting trees, women holding the national flag, and images of a Togo no longer living in fear. Universities reopened. People who had been forced to leave the country started coming back: poets, musicians, and journalists who had fled years ago returned home to a different Togo. The streets weren't full of whispers anymore, they were full of song. International observers came, but this time they weren't there to watch another fake election. They came to see a people finally able to speak freely. The African Union, pushed by the Sahel countries, like Burkina Faso and Mali, welcomed the changes. Even ECOWAS, which had often been accused of supporting existing rulers, sent a rare message of support: "Togo has chosen a path of dignity. We must now choose to walk with them." And in a small village far from the capital, an old man told a visiting journalist, "I never thought I'd live to see the day Togo would be free. I only wish my father could have seen it." The journalist asked, "What changed everything?" The old man smiled and said, "Someone said no, and they really meant it.